Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Tanvi and I'll be your host for this session. I would like to extend a special thank you to our wonderful speakers for today, Charley Rattan and Rakesh Maharaj.
Hi, Tan.
In today's session, we will be covering what in perpetuity energy zones are, how lifetime extensions may be the solution to improving investor confidence in renewable generation, and then we'll explore how safety regulations can be leveraged upon with clever contracting strategies. We have quite a diverse audience with us today, with people joining us from across the globe and working in both onshore and offshore sectors. This presents our speakers with quite the challenge, but we're going to try and cater to everyone's needs. If at any point you do have a question that isn't being addressed, please do ask. So before we start and I introduce Charley, I'd like to go through some housekeeping points with you. So you can ask any questions using the big marker control panel or through our Twitter handle using the hashtag #AskARMSA. And we'll be running polls throughout this webinar, so definitely get involved. We'll try and keep you on your toes by giving you about 5 seconds to answer them. And the session will be recorded and will be sent to you following the presentation for your own purposes or to share with others. We'll also make the slides available to you as well. All right, now on to the exciting stuff. Let me introduce to you our first speaker for today, Charley Rattan. Charley is an independent renewable energy consultant and trainer with many years of experience of senior level experience within the onshore and offshore wind industry. He's the former risk manager for the Seagreen offshore wind farm and has 15 years of experience and a strong track record of innovation within offshore wind. He regularly works with government key stakeholders for sector consultation responses and has project managed the construction of a wind farm in Cornwall, and he's led the repowering of that site. Charley has also been involved with specialist asset management modelling for offshore wind farms in France. And today he'll be sharing his experience and expertise with you on how the wind power industry could be better managed over a 50-year life cycle. Over to you, Charley.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Tanmeet. Good day, everybody. And a brief overview of the items to be discussed in the next few minutes. We'll be looking at asset integrity, monitoring and management regimes in preparation for a potential 50-year life cycle. The importance of acquiring and managing data for long-term performance. And building for perpetuity. What are the constraints? Are they due just to warranty periods? Are there others? We'll consider that. So, it sounds long time, 50-year lifetime asset management, 50 years. They were probably never designed for that, but we can see from the slide on the left, was feeding into offshore. The lessons learned from offshore are feeding back into onshore with a circular. And offshore, it is critical with vessel considerations, tidal considerations, siting of O&M bases on ports. So maintenance and availability is absolutely crucial for project viability and maintenance offshore. A number of opportunities have emerged in the industry. Renewables can indeed operate for 50 years because that's exactly what has happened and is happening as we speak. Slide on the right shows that perhaps that experience and learning can be extended out to wind, both on and offshore. So the 50-year life cycle, well, as I said, it is happening. It's happening with hydro. It's a case study. It's long-term asset management. It's 50 years and counting. And project life wasn't perhaps an initial consideration with the drive for electricity in the Glens in the 30s, realised in the 1940s with the drive for electrification. And actually, a lot of the Scottish hydro facilities that are operational were actually built by German prisoners of war in the late 1940s. There have been developments since. There have been developments in asset integrity, monitoring, the management regimes involved, getting them to prepare that 50-year life cycle. But I was with SSE, which is actually known as Scottish Hydro north of the border. They conducted a fairly detailed review of the assets in 2014, and they were perfect. The assets were as good as the day they were built in the 1940s, and it certainly whetted the SSE appetite for more. Now, Tanmeet mentioned in the introduction that we'll be asking the odd poll as we go through. Keep you on your toes, as she said. So the question is on the poll is, what do you think is preventing, should you still have one, your wind farm from operating for 50 years? And please choose as many as applicable. You can see it could be warranty expiration, turbine wear, balance of plant issues, technological advances, or it could be other factors. We'll just give you a few seconds to consider your answers and then move on to the next slide. Okay, so obviously to run for long periods of time, we need data. We need to think about the importance of acquiring and managing data for that long-term performance. Offshore wind, it uses SCADA, stands for Supervisory Control, Data Acquisition. And it also uses CMS, Condition Monitoring Systems. These come in different guises. Each turbine manufacturer's got a slightly different offering. They're all recognizable for slightly different alerts, slightly different information. And they're improving all the time. People are thinking about neural pathways now for SCADA to get even more data, even more relevant to enable the long-term operation and to feed into the operation and maintenance strategies. The warranties which underpin turbines, they've improved. It used to be 3 years, it moved up to 5 years. Increased. I've signed a turbine agreement, a TSA, for 12 years, which was onshore. That principle is now moving offshore. And we've also got availability figures. They used to start in 95, 96, 97% availability, creeping up to 98 and beyond. And the target is 100% availability. It sounded fanciful a few years ago, less fanciful now, all helping drive the industry forward. Industry is mature for onshore and indeed offshore now. We've learned a whole heap of lessons. We've learned them about offshore. We've learned them about gearboxes. We've learned lessons about blades, bearings, and foundations. And onshore is fed into the process, and now it's reversing. Offshore years, we're talking about a 50-year lease, which is the norm for offshore wind farms in UK waters. The seabed owner is the Crown Estate, now divided between London and Edinburgh. Traditionally, those leases come in 50 years. And it's 50 years to allow a repowering. I think the feeling is that rather have one project run for 50 years, the lease would be sufficiently long to encourage the developer to make a long-term commitment and to think about repowering in the midst of it. So that's why it's 50 years with a repowering opportunity built in. The industry is built up. It started with round one, 20 so years ago, small, I think 30 turbine machines up to 90 megawatts, quite small by today's standards, considered massive at the time. Later rounds have built upon that. The figures have got higher. And over the time period as well, the warranties underpinning projects has got longer, so from 5 to 10 and even beyond that of turbines, and other bits of balance of plant as well, especially with cabling. The industry's taken different approaches to cabling, including looking at redundancy and building in additional capacity right from the outset. Also, foundations, an important part of the offshore project. And all of that has led to an uplift in both banker and investor confidence for the industry. Going forward, well, Tanmeet mentioned in the introduction in perpetuity zones. They're not quite there yet. They're being considered. Talk about an industry sector deal. It may not even fall within that, but it is actively being discussed. Now, it's important to recall that this is for the zone rather than for individual projects. The projects will still need to be assessed. They'll still go through a rigorous process, but it will mean that the zone itself may have a slightly longer tenor and indeed be for in perpetuity. It sounds fanciful, but other zones are indeed on that basis for other stakeholders. I'm thinking of some interests such as defence or marine or some of the ecological stakeholders, that the zones, national parks, in perpetuity. And one outcome of that will be that other stakeholders will be working around renewables. So rather than renewables working around them, others will work around renewables. And going forward, we need to think about, as an industry, how to decommission. These strategies tend to be thought of early, but they need to be refined and they need to be addressed in line with the company's existing hierarchies. They tend to have hierarchies of recycling, reuse, and so forth that they use elsewhere in the construction process, and that can be applied to decommissioning as well. One issue is that the Crown Estate tends to like, in the lease, seabeds to be returned to the condition in which they were found. And now that might not necessarily be the best case for offshore wind. There's a lot of cabling, and whether that cable is perhaps something that needs to be addressed. Oil and gas have addressed some of these issues regarding things like artificial reefs have been considered, but that does need stakeholder buy-in. And all of that needs to be tied into an issue that is quite well talked about at the moment, and that's a circular economy and sustainability, and integrated into that as well. Decommissioning strategies, they've got strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, just like anything else. It can be major projects that can bring benefits to communities. We mentioned that artificial reefs have been considered oil and gas, but that needs to be guided and driven by stakeholders. It needs their buy-in. It can't just be tacked on towards the end of a project. It needs to be considered perhaps early on. Innovation has moved on in the industry, and floating machines have come along, and they might offer some different solutions to decommissioning. In theory, there's no fixed foundation, fewer intrusive elements to the decommissioning process, and it might be a case of towing them back to shore for decommissioning. All of the various innovations have helped to reduce the levelized cost of energy, called project costs, and there will be implications of all of those, of all the innovations driving them going forward. A few key takeaways from this session, in that renewables already have a proven track record of a 50-year project, plus life cycles. It's been proved can work. It's happened in hydro, and wind and sister technologies can learn from that experience. They're seeking to replicate them. Warranties are being pushed out, other bits of kit being pushed out, and that makes it an enabler. It's sending great confidence through the industry and the wider investor community as well. And I, together with ARMSA, will go into further depth. Seminar series, watch out for the updates, and we'll go into more depth on some of the takeaways discussed here.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for your wonderful presentation. We are looking to improve this webinar series for the future, so we'd have a quick poll for you. If you found this session valuable, please do answer the poll that's on your screen right now. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Rakesh Maharaj, and he will be taking you through everything that you need to know to master CDM regulations. Rakesh is an applied systems practitioner and management specialist who specializes in the use of business tools together with applied system thinking techniques to optimize strategic and operational system integrations. Rakesh advises on onshore and offshore wind owner-operators on alignment of commercial, contracting, and regulatory compliance strategies across all phases of the lifecycle, including construction, major component replacement campaigns, repowering, and decommissioning. He has over 12 years' experience in supply chain optimization within the renewables sector in multiple jurisdictions ranging from Brazil to Ukraine. His primary interest is in designing high-reliability organizations safely, and has used this skill in advising onshore and offshore clients to better manage its assets, transitional and post-warranty risks. Over to you, Rakesh.
Tanmeet, thank you very much. And Charlie, that was an excellent presentation. One of the lessons that I find in practice that are not being transferred onshore to offshore and vice versa, or even amongst onshore and offshore projects themselves, is the manner in which the construction design and management regulations apply. Now, one might argue that's perhaps because of the rather convoluted and complex commercial and contracting strategies, but there are a whole host of reasons for them. Today, what we're going to be talking about, whether regulation is a friend or foe. We're going to be looking at the various corporate and individual obligations arising from not only the construction design and management regulations, but the wider framework act that it sits under. We'll touch a little bit on the design risk assessment and how it might be used practically to offer lifecycle value. And we'll spend a few minutes just discussing the advantages and disadvantages of corporate standards. Is it something that's too resource demanding, or does it actually add value to the project itself? A little bit of context first. I think the numbers on the slide speak for themselves. Roughly reported 2,265 accidents, of which 184 resulted in fatalities, 383 blade failures. I think any one of you who looks at the source may be questioning the validity of this information. I suspect you might be right to do so, given the fact that it is largely unofficial. But the point being that even one fatality is too much, and the number of accidents are clearly too high. Let's look at the numbers in more detail. So, according to Kate Ness, again, what they have been reporting is that 61% of fatalities involve divers, construction, maintenance engineers, or even small turbine owner-operators. Imagine these landowners having to climb up their turbine, examine what's going wrong, and finding that they would not return again. Or even 163 resulting in human injury, mainly again involving construction and maintenance workers. And in the UK, 6 members of the public were injured. I don't think you would want to decide to go out for a walk one day not knowing that you probably might not come back whilst out on the countryside. 14 incidents of fire were reported in 2018, 3 structural failures, 2 ice throw incidents, one of them having to be reported to have traveled 140 meters, and 5 transport accidents, which apparently seems to be the source of most public fatalities arising from renewables undertakings. When working with organizations, it's very difficult to determine whether organizations consider CDM to be a friend or foe. Now, we are talking about CDM in the context of the UK, but for those of you who have joined us from Europe, don't forget the Temporary and Mobile Worksites Directive imposes the same structure, expectation, and responsibility. So does the construction safety regulations in Ireland, or indeed those regulations which are similar in Brazil and Mexico for those of you that are joining us from there. But the bottom line is, how do we approach the obligations coming from law? Some organizations approach it with a compliance mentality or philosophy. And as long as we're able to tick those boxes to demonstrate that apparently we are doing things, then we're able to show compliance. On the other hand, organizations seek to go one step further, and through some third-party certification, kite mark, whether it's OSAS or ISO nowadays, provides the senior management team or boards or leadership of organizations that, due to the fact that the approach has been accredited by a third party, that things have to be safe on site. The number of fatal accident investigations we undertake within organizations enjoying the benefits of kite marks indicate that assurance doesn't necessarily assure safety on the ground. And then on the extreme of the spectrum, you have those organizations, particularly the innovative and lean-orientated businesses, who want to employ informed decision-making in what they do. And these are the types of organizations that see safety as an outcome, and it's the outcome of how they do business and the manner in which they align their enablers. There is a poll associated with the slide. You have around 5 seconds. Reflect on your organization, and what do you think? Do you think that your organization is compliance-driven, assurance-driven, or one that is decision-making oriented? Thank you very much. So let's move on. So for those of you who are curious about what decision-making orientation looks like, that's what I will cover in the next few slides. Those that are decision-making orientated recognize that business enablers and the alignment and consideration of these often produce several beneficial outcomes. So by leveraging the enablers, the outcomes and the benefits are much greater than just safety alone. What are these? Well, in very simple terms, if you're focusing on getting the right number of people with the right skills, doing the right jobs, using the right tools, in the right place at the right time, then inherently you're understanding the risk associated with that job design, operational design, project design, or whatever it might be, and eliminating it within the design process before you make commercial decisions which result in dysfunctional work processes being deployed on the ground. And dysfunctional work processes being deployed on the ground will result in ineffectiveness, certainly won't be done right first time, and unfortunately people will be hurt. You might be asking, well, that's great. So what happens next? If we understand the philosophy, how do we integrate what we do with that philosophy? Well, on this particular slide, you'll be able to see the mapping of some of the key decisions involved in the renewables marketplace and associating them with business enablers. It's often the commercial strategy, contract strategy, the manner in which the contracting organizations work, whether it's a command or control or an enabling project organization, or the skills and the resources that are brought together in the early stage alignment that determine whether you have the right number of people with the right skills in the right positions during project delivery. And that's absolutely crucial. In terms of ensuring that tasks are well thought out, correctly specified and clarified, the things that you would typically do in practice at the enabling level or feed level will be specifications, designs, working out interface management, particularly where you have multiple work packages, producing an integrated master schedule to see how these come together. And for those organizations who adopt a more mature and advanced approach to project management, we'll be looking at critical path analysis and critical path management, because ultimately, if you get these wrong, then your work delivery effectively is out of control. And if your work delivery is out of control, you can't rely on your site-based safety plan or indeed your RAMs to bring this under control to the point where significant hazards and risks are identified and controlled. And finally, from an environmental standpoint, work scheduling is incredibly important, because work scheduling correlates with simultaneous operations. You're able to use scheduling to reduce that. Provision of welfare facilities for multiple contractors, consulting with them is incredibly important. But if you've already made the two key front-end decisions in terms of who you're going to engage and on what basis, then if you consult with them, there is only so much of value that consultation will add. So early stage consultation is incredibly important. Access to difficult areas, particularly if you're operating offshore or indeed even onshore. Access roads, particularly following inclement weathers, or in the case of many years ago when new projects were evolving, access was incredibly difficult on using Arctic lorries on civil roadways. There is a poll here. In your organization, given what we've just been talking about, is CDM a friend or foe? Or actually, does your organization not really give too much of consideration to CDM at an appropriate time? Thank you very much for that. We'll move on to the next slide. So many practitioners have often asked me, when discussing enabling factors and aligning enabling factors with regulatory compliance, what about protecting one's legal position? And therefore, it is incredibly important to understand how you align the key duties that exist in law with your enabling strategy. Well, the key duty holders that many of you here in the UK will recognize with the client, the principal designer, and the principal contractor. For those of you working overseas, I think the titles in themselves are relatively self-explanatory. I know in Ireland you might call them PSDP and PSCS, contractors, designers, and in the UK we have overarching obligations arising in the Act in the form of Section 2, which relates to clients or employees' obligations to their own employees, or Section 3 for that matter, which is employees' obligations to almost everybody else. Remembering that CDM in the UK, Northern Ireland, as well as the Republic, sits under the overarching Act, so these obligations are much greater. How do you align the fulfillment of these obligations with a decision-making orientated approach? Well, I'll map that out on the next slide. It does appear to be busy, but you'll be able to recognize that there are certain duties that exist in the enabling phase or in the feed phase where these duty holders will need to be involved or will certainly need to have an input. And these are mapped out here in terms of C, which means client, PC, principal contractor, and PD, principal designer. Whilst I appreciate that this might be quite a lot for you to take in at this stage, remember that slides will be made available to you at the end of the session. Moving on to design. What is design from a safety perspective? Well, most often than not, working with organizations, design seems to be limited to structural elements of what's being constructed. So in the case of a wind farm, it's the foundations, it's the access, it's the turbine itself. Well, I guess that particular point's a bit debatable, dependent on whether you're being sold something called plug and play or not. We'll touch upon that a little later. But essentially, design includes, at a fundamental level, the asset and the asset design, the operation, what is being done and by whom and how, and finally, schedule. When it's being done, how are people being brought together, and what type of people are being brought together, particularly given the growth of multinational teams to deliver projects at different times. All of these are designs, whether they are people-orientated design, work-orientated design, or structural-orientated design. There's a poll associated with this slide. In your organization, what approach do you take to safety in design? Is it largely technical or much wider than that? Thank you very much. So we'll be moving on to design risk assessment. And in design risk assessment, this is quite an interesting evolving area, given the fact that the concept of it was introduced formally in 2007, way back with the previous set of regulations in the UK at the very least. There are several difficulties that even current organizations and developers and project teams are faced with in terms of design risk assessment. And the tendency is to rely very heavily on the contracting, engineering, and technical specialists to conduct design risk assessments of their work packages or their work scopes and feed these in to the principal designer. In practice, the principal designer needs to extract this information and pass it across to the principal contractor so that the principal contractor may take the residual hazards into account when planning their work. But if the inputs into the principal designer is not harmonized, the principal designer is now left with the task of harmonizing a set of data and passing it on to the principal contractor. In that harmonization process, it's very often that the principal contractor adds bias into that harmonization, which means that the principal contractor is not necessarily always getting the relevant data. So for principal designers or organizations working as principal designers, it's incredibly important to give early consideration to how you go about harmonizing the design risk assessment process down the supply chain involving companies who will have a design role. We all know that the purpose of design risk assessment is to eliminate hazards at an early enough stage and mitigate those that are residual. But also, in addition to that, it's about being able to forecast how the hazards that are residual or might manifest through the life cycle. We do have to remember that foreseeability decreases with time, especially if we are looking at projects in perpetuity. But if we are looking at 50-year projects, foreseeability begins to decrease even further. This is a challenge that many designers today and will continue to face in the future. The next aspect that we often are challenged with, or our clients are challenged with, is this concept of acquiring machines that are effectively plug and play. But what does plug and play mean from a regulatory perspective? I guess if you have a plug and play device that you're connecting to your computer via a USB closed device, you have very little idea of what's actually happening inside. That device in its entirety is considered to be, or ought to be considered to be, safe before you plug it in. But when you look at a turbine or a machine in itself, it comprises several systems, subsystems, whether they happen to be electrical, mechanical, or otherwise. And these have to work harmoniously, particularly when the machine begins to be subject to stresses. So onshore, deep water projects, the stresses are much greater. And as machines age, the stresses increase as well. So we do need to know not only whether the parts in themselves are safe, but also the manner in which they work together is safe. So requesting hazard operability studies or hazards or design assessments from OEMs is something that I tend to find clients are doing far more proactively these days. And I have noticed that there is also an increase in the type, value, and content of information that's being provided by OEMs to clients, although I think we all agree there's opportunities for improvement in this area. Design risk assessment, if done correctly, adds a lot of value to the life cycle, not only from a health and safety perspective, because ultimately residual risks arising throughout the construction through commissioning and testing phase can be fed into a maintenance management system and operational protocols that the O&M teams then continue to use during the O&M phases of the wind farm. Not having recorded design risks at an early enough stage compromises and prejudices the O&M teams from understanding the status of plant or indeed the environments where they are. So let's create one truth by having an effective design risk assessment process. Design assessments are undertaken using various methodologies, and this slide depicts the typical methodologies that we tend to see in practice. The various types of methodologies ranging on the right-hand side from what if to checklist, HAZOPs, and hazards are all fundamentally or primarily designed to help organizations identify hazards, whereas the more involved tools such as fault tree analysis, bow ties, FMEAs, not only serve to identify hazards, but evaluate how they may manifest in various scenarios. So essentially, these are predictive toolkits. Regardless of whether you choose the ones on the left or the grouping on the right, the ultimate objective of any design assessment is to control existing hazards and continue to identify residual risk that is likely to manifest through the life cycle. Approaching the end, and the next topic we're going to be touching on is corporate standards. Do they add value, or indeed do they create a distraction? Well, many utility organizations have various corporate policies and standards. Some organizations who work globally have global standards which they wish to ensure that controls the risk on projects that are under development, construction, or operation and maintenance across the portfolio footprint. Basis of any form of governance in corporate organization is the policy, and standards are then generally produced from that. But it's not easy to just produce a standard, because many of you working within global organizations know that jurisdictional requirements and regulatory needs have to be balanced with what the corporate expectation is. And I use the word balance because in some instances we know it goes beyond that. In many countries, I tend to find that whilst global standards are written with the best of intent, in some instances they even conflict with jurisdictional relevant and local regulation as well. Jurisdictional arrangements generally support global standards. So if you're working in a particular region, the arrangements have to be specific to the region. They need to be strong, both in terms of driving effectiveness, and have to be technically sound. But they also have to ensure that global standards are being met with, particularly when the global organization is exercising governance and assurance. And squaring that circle is not the easiest thing to do. What we do have to remember is that regardless of whether it's a corporate policy or a global standard, or whether it's jurisdictional arrangements that are written to comply with local law, the project determines the need. The need to ensure that its risk profile, its unique contracting strategy, its unique project organization is controlled. So therefore, you should not necessarily consider copy-pasting project procedures from one project to another, as we see is commonplace today. There's a poll associated with this slide. We'd be very interested in your view as to whether you think corporate standards are either mostly value-adding, or whether you would like to exercise some freedom at a local level. So in summary, this is a growing market. Charley will be sharing some local figures with you in his next set of slides, but I, having just returned from Dubai, where the Dubai Supreme Council on Energy have announced that over the next 12 years, they will be installing in excess of 5 gigawatts worth of renewables. onshore. That's just one example. The market in South America has grown substantively. We know that the Southeast Asian markets, the pathway to, I was going to use the term explosion, I think I won't, but substantive growth and technological developments invariably are going to lead the growth of this market. With technological developments, are hazards and risks going to be foreseeable, or is the rate of growth going to prevent us from being able to pause for thought to identify future hazards that might occur? If we don't, there will be increasing incident and accident rates, projects will be ineffective, we'll be making very quick decisions that are likely to affect availability and asset integrity. Approach to regulation is incredibly important because, as I have demonstrated, utilizing regulation can actually help underpin the rigor of a project because it tells us those decisions that we need to be making and when. If our approach to regulation is one that is merely compliance orientated, regulatory compliance will always follow the enabling decisions that have been made. And if those enabling decisions have not been made carefully or have not been thought through in terms of the potential control problems it might create, then unfortunately your project will not benefit from regulation and it will be seen as a foe or an evil necessity. Adopting consistent and holistic business decision-making and processes is hugely beneficial for project delivery. Not just project delivery in terms of on time, on schedule, or on budget, but also in terms of protecting people, structures, and the environment. This can be achieved at a local level through harmonized design risk assessments. And those harmonized design risk assessments can effectively be your one truth information input for asset lifecycle. And finally, if you do have corporate standards, ensure that you understand that the corporate standard together with the local arrangements or project requirements are being met equally and that one doesn't overtake the other. Thank you very much for your attention. You back to Tanmeet.
Thank you very much, Rakesh, for that very informative session. And we do have another poll to see whether this session was valuable to you. Please do answer and let us know. If you do have any questions for either of our speakers today, so Charley or Rakesh, you can ask them on our Q&A panel within the big marker window, or you can ask them using our Twitter, which is #AskArmsa. All right, next up, we have Charley again. He'll be going through 3 models for wind turbine asset management. Over to you, Charley.
Thank you, Tanmeet. Thank you, Rakesh. And in this session, we'll be exploring potential models for wind asset management. We're looking at the key implications of them, their advantages, and their disadvantages. It was mentioned by Rakesh that there were some interesting facts and figures coming up, and here's the UK situation. It's since been revised. Yesterday, 3 gigawatts plus of extensions were acknowledged by the Crown Estate. In addition to that, the Crown Estate in London is looking at an additional 6 gigawatts of offshore capacity by 2030. And in addition to that, the Scottish Crown Estate, based in Edinburgh, also looking at extensions to the offshore fleet and new sites in the Scottish portion of UK territorial waters. So big expansion here in the UK. And that's been reflected globally. I'm in Canada next week, where aspirations are being expressed for offshore wind. The United States, Taiwan, every day, another country appears to come to the offshore game. An overview of the offshore project lifecycle, perhaps a little bit simplistic because the portion that we are interested in, operations and maintenance, it just forms 1/5 on a slide like this, but actually in reality it forms the bulk of the project life cycle. Operations and maintenance traditionally have been over 20 years. We're now talking about pushing that out 50 years in perpetuity. What does it mean? But operations and maintenance already, even though they're 1/5 of the slides, already form the bulk of the project life cycle. So offshore wind at the moment, the ownership, it's still dominated by utilities or utility style owners, and they represent nearly 62% of the market. Traditionally, these companies, they're firms with roots in hydrocarbons, but they may have restructured out of these markets or moved towards renewables in recent years. And there's a growing ownership stake. They include people like financial investors, pension providers, and so on. And their involvement is a sign that the sector is maturing. And that has led to 3 models emerging for wind asset ownership. So these are the 3 owners that in the last 20 years or so have come to the fore in the UK, which is the perhaps the world leader of offshore wind, and in Europe and increasingly beyond. And we'll go through them, but we can see that there's the owner-operator model, a hybrid model, and a third-party operator model. An owner-operator model, a good example of that is Greater Gabbard off the Suffolk coast. It's a very successful scheme. In fact, yesterday it was announced that SSE were keen to expand Greater Gabbard, the site. They're keen to retain ownership of the existing site and develop further sites to extend it. And it's been a big success for that utility. It's Greater Gabbard was support enabled, and as I mentioned, the extension was announced in the public domain yesterday. There are a number of advantages of the owner operating the wind farm throughout the operation and maintenance stages. And there are usually utilities that have developed in the UK. It takes deep pockets to be an offshore wind developer and operator. It enables vertical integration. Many utilities have generation arms, but they might also have transmission arms. There might be an in-house DNO. There might be in-house capabilities elsewhere, which is good to enable vertical integration. And it allows the utility to self-perform tasks which the utility might learn from the turbine manufacturers, how to maintain the machines, train people up in-house, and enable them to self-perform many of the operation and maintenance requirements going forward. It enables the utility to transfer information. Usually utilities tend to have portfolios. Very few have single sites. So the portfolio often might be staggered. It might be 2 or 3 years between each individual project in the portfolio. And it enables information to trickle through the portfolio for one project to learn from the predecessor project to enable a long-term continuous improvement. So many utilities do have their processes in place, and they have some kind of clear management, and they've increasingly realized in recent years that the interfaces themselves need management. We're talking about many utilities tend to develop as joint ventures, and they interface with turbine manufacturers and innovations, all of which require management, interfacing to keep the project aligned. And speaking of that, the alignment must be, or for a utility, it's very important that they align their activities to the company values. You mentioned these. Most utilities have fairly noble values in the UK. They certainly encompass health and safety and doing the right thing, and it enables the wind farm to be operated, maintained in accordance with those values. Disadvantages, well, they are time consuming, cumbersome. They take time to set up, quite a lot of administration involved. And they may suit regulated bodies, which most of the utilities usually are, and that might not suit profit maximisation, so it might not be the most profitable way forward. Increasingly, the industry is moving to this model, the hybrid model. There we go. We can see that EDF Renewables, shown an example of this. They've retained a controlling share in a project, but they've sold on part of the portfolio or the project. And this is a model that the pension infrastructure people, Dalmore have indicated works for them with EDF, and it's one that's more likely to be prevalent going forward. We can see that Legal and General are mentioned. They're taking a hybrid approach, and others are following suit as well. So it's increasing in popularity, the hybrid model. Maybe the industry norm in years going forward. Hybrid model has advantages. The knowledge is shared, which reduces overall risk. We've got a sharing of knowledge. We've got the operator remains involved, so they bring all the design work, all the history, all the knowledge is brought to the table and shared with the new owner. It allows some alignment of activities to company values that they're usually pretty strong. If it's a utility, certainly the ones that I've worked for have been very strong on company values. But it also allows each party to concentrate on what they're good at, their individual strengths. Disadvantages can be time consuming, all needs negotiating, and when does the negotiation take place? And it needs a clear management of interfaces. In addition to the two models, there's a third-party model, which may suit people. It may suit people like pension funds and bond investors, people who are not wind experts. They understand financial returns, but they're not experts in wind development, operation, construction, decommissioning. And to address the third-party model, where the owner is the third party, a number of utilities themselves are now moving to offer one-stop operations and maintenance shops, and they help ease risk help ease the risk anxieties. And there's an example on the right. Third-party model brings a number of advantages. The new owner is spared development. They don't have to go through the pain, which is painful to develop wind farm offshore. They don't need to go through that. They don't need to worry about the planning conditions, drafting them, implementing them, agreeing them, and they don't need to worry about any particular construction issues. They take over the site when it's oven ready, so they don't need to bother about the development process, and they can concentrate on profit maximization and revenue streams. A number of disadvantages of the third-party model. Again, it can be cumbersome, legal requirements, complex warranties, differing lengths of warranties, and there's amount of due diligence to be gone through, and the timings as well. So a number of key takeaways from this session, which is concentrated on the three emerging models. And we've heard from Rakesh that the market is growing, and it's growing rapidly. It's growing globally. Technology is developing. The new developments might focus on battery arrays. They might focus on the production of hydrogen. They might focus on floating machines, a combination of those, still with fixed foundation machines. And we need to think about robust business processes, clear management of interfaces. And we've heard from Rakesh a bit about processes and corporate governance, and are they a friend or foe? So we need to think about that as well. And we need to think about end-to-end project involvement, particularly when to get involved in a project.
Thank you very much, Charlie. We do have a poll for this session to see whether this session was valuable to you. Please do let us know. And once we've done that poll, we'll move on to our Q&A session. Like I said, throughout, you can ask questions using the big market control panel or through our Twitter. So we have had a few questions come in. So the first would be, what does the term veil of warranties mean? I think that's a question for you, Rakesh.
Right, so a veil of warranties, that's an interesting one. I tend to use that phrase pretty often within the context of regulatory compliance expectation, most often than not when an asset owner outsources the asset management to the party, or particularly to the OEM during warranty phase. There is an expectation that the asset manager or the asset owner has that the asset manager will be enabling the asset owner to comply with their obligations, but that is not necessarily true. The OEM who's managing the asset is largely driven by mitigating the risk to assets as well as mitigating the risk to their organizations, which may not always be in the best interest of the asset owner. So the veil of warranty, whilst providing assurance from a fiscal perspective and availability perspective and an operability perspective, does not necessarily mean from a compliance perspective that the asset owner's obligations are being fulfilled.
Thank you, Rakesh. We've had another question come in that says, in the 50-year project, is the technology expected to remain the same?
Yeah, thanks, Tanmeet. I think one thing we've learned in the 18 or 20 years of offshore in the UK, which is the world leader, is that absolutely not is the answer to that. turbines have got bigger. They've gone from perhaps 2, 3, 5 megawatts. Now the next generation will be 10 megawatts and above. There will be floating machines. The industry is considering whether it can be linked in with tidal arrays, whether it can be linked in with offshore battery arrays, whether it can be linked in with the offshore production of hydrogen. So the answer is absolutely not. The new sites will be renewable energy plants rather than just pure offshore wind farms. Technology changes all the time, and although we talk about in perpetuity and 50 years, those are to allow project certainty, but within the zones, the projects will absolutely be different going forward and be much more smart going forward.
Thank you very much, Charlie. We've had another question come in regards to the first poll. What does ARMSA think is preventing our wind farms from operating for 50 years, onshore and offshore?
Me to have got that,
Yeah.
Onshore, the machinery does wear out. You've got bearings, you've got like your car. You wouldn't think about driving your car for 50 years unless you perhaps a classic. But the kit has worn out. The early warranties reflected that. It does need a bit of maintenance. But over the years, it's improved. New technologies come in, direct drive machines. Some of the bearings have been designed out, hydraulic machines or hydraulic drive chains. So the technology has improved. Now, I'd still be reluctant to run a machine for 50 years because it may be obsolete. Anybody that comes from an IT background knows that that's the case, but you might get a good long life cycle, and you might be thinking about recycling your early machines. I sold a number of machines from Cornwall. They're still spinning in Eastern Europe, and that's nearly 30 years ago. So with good maintenance and a suitable choice, it's possible to get much longer. I wouldn't specify 50 years, but you can get much longer out of your existing machines.
So, Charlie, within the existing offshore projects, do you envisage, should their lifetime be extended to 50 years, that the current technology will last, or do you expect there to be technological modifications in order to reach that lifetime expectation?
Yeah, the ones that are out there at the moment are relatively small, Rakesh. So technically they might get longer lifestyle, but whether they're optimizing the wind in the locations they are is another matter. So I suggest a better use of them would be to reuse the site with the wind resource, which is excellent for bigger machines, which would leave the kit free for recycling. And there might be startup countries that there might be countries with visual impacts off the coastline that with smaller machines, and it's hard to believe that we're saying that 3.5, 3.6 megawatt machines are now considered small, but that is the reality. So they might fit certain locations. Obviously, they will enable projects to become live much more cheaply because the kit is pre-owned, and it might help bootstrap the next generation of sites, and it might be somewhere else on the globe, somebody that's thinking about becoming a player in the offshore market, enable them to do it in a cost-effective manner. So the kit, if it's well maintained, will last a lot longer than the project initial life of 20 years, moving towards 50. I suspect we're not quite there yet, but it's moving in that direction.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So we've got one more question for you for today. In regards to the renewable energy zones being talked about within the industry, is this onshore as well as offshore, Charlie?
Yes, good question. Indeed it is. It's a lot of this is not necessarily in the public domain yet, but I've been involved in consultations in the UK where we've taken the view that perhaps national parks and things like that are considered to be pretty much perpetuity, and that perhaps it would be prudent, therefore, to select areas away from large concentrations of people, where the resource is known to be there, and designate them in perpetuity. So the discussions are going on, and they do indeed encompass both on and offshore resources.
Well, I'd like to add to that because from a regulatory standpoint, there are questions about deep water projects, particularly deep water projects that exist between shorelines of different countries as to whose legislation might apply. And I think the government would, together with the Crown Estate many years ago, decided to allocate renewable energy zones offshore specifically in consultation with neighboring countries to determine where UK law would apply. The renewable energy zone order is available on the web together with a supporting map which highlights specifically those deep water zones which are called renewable energy zones, wherein UK regulation will specifically apply.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today, unfortunately, for our Q&A session. But if you do have a question that we haven't answered, we'll get in touch with you after the webinar. Don't forget that ARMSA Academy will be launching soon. So if the CDM topic in particular resonated with you, you can join one of our open programs. We'll be in touch with you after the webinar is over to give you more details on that. You might be interested to know that 70% of our audience today highlighted that they would attend a webinar covering a subject connecting strategy with practice for the role of the asset manager. So do keep in touch with us. We will be producing this very shortly and we'll let you know when it's ready. Thank you to both Rakesh and Charlie for answering the questions from our live session. If you are, however, listening to this recorded session and have any questions for either of our speakers, please email them to us at info@armsa.co.uk or ask us using the hashtag AskArmsa on Twitter. I'd like to extend a thank you to all of you for attending and engaging with us throughout this webinar. We hope you found it useful. So stay connected with us either through email or through your favourite social media channel. Thank you once again and have a wonderful day.